We've done 2 videos fairly recently about species that weren't good recruitment candidates for the Jedi and the Sith, respectively. In both videos, we mentioned species that were naturally inclined to one side of the Force or the other, something that may have gotten some of you curious. What other species in the Star Wars universe had built-in inclinations to one side of the Force or the other? In this video, we're going to be looking at a bunch of them and talking about what caused those sorts of patterns.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Firstly, we have 2 clarifications to make just before we get into things. To start, just because we say a species is naturally inclined in one direction or the other, doesn't mean there weren't members of that species that swung the other way. The vast majority of Sith Purebloods were Darksiders, for example, and the Sith species as a whole was naturally drawn toward the dark side. However, there were a few rare examples of light-sided Sith Purebloods. All of the natural inclinations we're going to talk about today were instincts and influences that would lead most beings one way or the other, not some sort of weird genetic destiny. Additionally, we are not going to be talking about species that didn't have natural inclinations one way or the other. This includes the vast majority of species, so if you don't see us discuss a major species in this video, that would be why. It wouldn't be exactly interesting if we were to list off a bunch of neutral species after all. Now, let's get into things. Starting with a species we already mentioned, the Sith Purebloods. We're sure you're absolutely shocked to hear the Sith of all species were inclined toward the dark side. Their species was aggressive by nature, and while aggression alone didn't determine Force alignment, sadism and brutality was all but baked into the Sith DNA. The Sith of Korriban had a fiercely oppressive caste system in place for so long that Sith of different castes actually became distinct subspecies. These subspecies, the Grotu, Masasi, Zugruk, and Kisai, or rather the slaves, warriors, engineers, and priests, had actually evolved to be terrible to each other in different ways, making what had started as an abominable societal structure into a literal part of Sith biology. This inbred cruelty made Sith perfect Darksiders. Few species had such a natural tendency toward the dark side as the Sith Purebloods, but we know of one that was able to come close to matching it, the Rakata. The Rakata, it seems, were conquerors by nature. On their homeworld of Lehon, evolution honed their predatory instincts into cruelty and malice. This wasn't helped by the fact that the Rakata were, by nature, cannibals, always quite literally hungry for each other's blood. This gave them a natural inclination for murder, which quite obviously is something that would push most Rakata to the dark side. Even Rakata who had learned to control those urges often struggled to keep them repressed. All over the galaxy, Aqualish were commonly found as thugs or pirate goons, for they, like the Sith and Rakata, were extremely aggressive by nature. They were commonly described as having had hair-trigger tempers, with many members of the species prone to violent outbursts. This was likely a remnant of some sort of predatory instinct, and it resulted in most Aqualish being extraordinarily aggressive. As we mentioned earlier, aggression alone didn't determine Force alignment, and we're going to discuss some light-sided aggressive species later on, but the extreme nature of the Aqualish rage often led Aqualish to commit murder or more serious crimes, such as genocide. In the case of the Aqualish, this natural fury inclined the species as a whole toward the dark side. However, it should be noted that Force-sensitive Aqualish were rare, and that many of the few we know of did end up becoming Jedi, albeit Jedi who struggled with the dark side more than most. A final example of dark side inclined species would be the Hutts. To nobody's surprise, the galaxy's physical manifestations of greed and corruption were indeed naturally drawn toward the dark side, as they were almost entirely selfish. Now, Hutt greed wasn't absolute by nature. One known Hutt, named Arba, was even known to have been somewhat charitable, if still greedy. Greed is something beings of most species struggled with, of course, but Hutts were greedy in the extreme and always wanted more. As greed was one of the quickest paths to the dark side, this made Hutts into ideal Darksiders. However, Force-sensitive Hutts were extraordinarily rare, perhaps for the better. We only know one example of a Force-sensitive Hutt, Beldorian, a dark Jedi who became the Conqueror King of Nam Chorios. Now, what about some species who are naturally inclined toward the light? Let's start with one of our favorites, the Athorians. Though the Athorians were known to have occasional violent outcasts, they were quite rare, and they couldn't have been more different from most members of their species. Athorians valued life above all things. They had a sort of natural love and awe for even the smallest of life forms, and the vast majority of them were pacifists. When separated from their herds, most Athorians took jobs as healers and naturalists, and few of them could bear to hurt another sentient being, even those that were actively hurting them. Only a few Athorians were exceptions to this rule, and they were almost entirely sociopaths. All this naturally inclined the Athorians toward the light, so much so that the Force-based religion that most Athorian herds built their lives around was seen as perfectly compatible with Jedi ideology. Many Athorians served as Jedi, and Athorian herds often worked with the Jedi Order's agricultural corps. Wookiees fell into a similar category as Athorians. They were much more aggressive by nature. Indeed, Wookiees were famed for their tempers, much like the Aqualish. But unlike the Aqualish, the Wookiees weren't usually angry. They were actually calm and peaceful by nature, unless pushed over the edge, and they saw many acts of aggression as being animalistic and beneath them. Like the Athorians, the Wookiees also had a natural respect for nature, born out of their species' dependence on Kashyyik's Roshir trees for survival. They cared deeply for the lives of other beings, and though they were also hunters by nature, they were still quite restrained in how violent they became. They were naturally inclined toward the light side, though due to their species' low rate of Force sensitivity, few Wookiee Jedi were ever seen. Another species that was naturally inclined toward the light side was the Keldor. As we've mentioned before, the Keldor had evolved to be extremely compassionate due to the harsh conditions of their homeworlds, and most of them had a keen sense of justice. Plo Koon, the most well-known member of this species, was a pretty good example of what the vast majority of Keldor were like. Caring, generous, and righteous to the core. The Keldor even had their own order of Force sensitives, the Barrandon Sages, whose ideology overlapped so much with the Jedi Order that the two were considered sister organizations. Keldor were rarely seen beyond their homeworld of Dorin, but those that were seen abroad were almost always Jedi Knights. Lastly, we have the Gren. Native to the planet Kinyan, the Gren were a highly communal species known widely for their intense need for companionship. This trait evolved as an extreme sort of herd mentality, which once kept the Gren safe from predators. In the modern age, however, this instinct resulted in the Gren being extremely social, dependent on community and companionship just to stay sane. Most Gren tended to be fiercely devoted to each other and would never knowingly allow another member of their community to come to harm. This attitude wasn't quite as strong in Gren who had evolved on colony worlds like Hock or Malastare, but it was always on display in Gren from Kinyan, who would act almost like overprotective parents toward other Gren at times. Even if it may seem annoying to us, this mentality meant that the Gren were naturally inclined toward the light side, as they almost entirely lacked the traits that usually led to the dark side. There were other species in the galaxy that leaned one way or the other, but most of them were quite similar to the others on this list. By and large though, most species had a mix of all the traits we discussed today, leading them to be neutral. Humans were an obvious example of this. Like in the real world, the average human in the Star Wars universe had aggressive instincts, but they also had overwhelming cooperative urges. Inclination to one side or the other varied wildly then between individuals. But what do you think? Would you like a part 2 on this video or something similar? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.